Uh, okay, hello everyone. Good evening or morning, depending on where you are. And I'd like to welcome everyone warmly to our fifth session of PATIO Conversations, in which we have Priya Jain and Ishita Shah running the session on architecture and media cultures, which is one of our 8 uh, themes that we look at in PATIO. And without further delay, I think I'll hand over the floor to Ishita and Priya to take over.
Thank you, Saptaki. Welcome, everyone, and wonderful to see room full for the first conversation under this sub-theme. And I think it's been very interesting and exercise to even look at what we meant under architecture and media culture. So to set the context, I'm just going to read out, most of you might have. The theme considers how the printed, audio, and visual sets operate as sites of architectural discourse, as well as means of syncretizing and popularizing architectural and building knowledge. From professional and trade journals such as the Bombay Builder and Mark, and A+D to treaties and pattern books, and from cinematic narratives to video archives, such as those of the National Film Development Corporation and the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, how do media cultures of the Indian Ocean Rim straddle the representational and built aspects of architecture? On the other side of it, how does the historical understanding of the built environment practices get informed by different forms of media and representation? We will particularly encourage and engage with new and emerging research, engaging with vernacular languages, micro-contexts, as well as practice-based approaches, often overlooked as sites of both professional and popular architectural discourse. So we do come in with this sense of it's a subject or it's a disciplinary area, which is still less recognized. There is a lot more perhaps work under identifying this theme that's required, and what better way to do it than actually have diverse professionals speak to us about their practices. And perhaps it's at PATIO that something else emerges. So today's session, which is the first few dialogues, will be under this theme. The intent will be to unpack some critical questions about the relevance of institutional support and culture for public scholarship across the region to practice new forms of writing histories of architecture and the built environment. The conversations will invite practitioners to reflect on their processes from ways of documenting change and intentions for building repositories or knowledge exchange to proposing possible outcomes of research-based practices. It will be inevitable to discuss relationships within their own projects, between practices across borders, and the impact of such interdisciplinarity on making the field viable and purposeful. So that's the larger context of this theme and the dialogues which will happen. I don't think it will be restricted to this theme. Of course, it will speak to the other themes from conversations to conversations. But over to you, Priya, about what's happening today.
Thank you, Ishita, and welcome everyone. So just a little bit about today's session. So first, Mehwish Abid from McGill University will present her research on Decolonizing Home Through Objects, which investigates stories of migration through objects and material culture in Pakistan. After that, Johann Peiris from the Collective for Historical Dialogue and Memory in Sri Lanka will reflect upon his research for the recent documentary film on architect Minette De Silva, titled, "Is This an Architectural Documentary?" Our respondent for today's session is architect and filmmaker Rohan Shivkumar, who serves as Dean of KRVIA Mumbai. Rohan will build on the discussion with his own experiences in filmmaking, curation, and education. As Ishita said, this first conversation under this theme, we wanted to pose some questions, not limited to, but kind of some of these, which are, how do the researchers position themselves in the project? What is the form of research? And how does their practice break boundaries in the field of research and representation? How is their work engaging with different communities and the public? And what drives their practice as a researcher and critical thinker? More detailed bios of the speakers will be posted in the chat. But with that, I think we want to move on with the talks. So I pass it on to our first speaker for today, Mehwish Abid.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Is this visible?
Yes, Mehwish.
Right. So thank you for having me, PATIO Network, Priya and Ishita. I'm very excited to be here. And I will be speaking about my ongoing research, Decolonizing Home Through Objects and Transformation. This project is approached through decolonial and collective memory framework in which I document micro-histories that reveal the then macro histories. There have been four transformations of this project, Material Culture and Decolonization, Post-Partition Lahore, which has resulted in a book chapter. Decolonizing Material Culture Through Oral Histories as Pedagogy. This has resulted in an elective course at one of the leading universities in Pakistan. Towards Decolonial Home, it was an effort to construct the archive, which I will speak about in detail. And then my study, PhD study at McGill School of Architecture, titled Home as Archive, Post-Colonial Housing in Lahore after the Partition of British India. Decolonizing Home Through Objects investigates the stories of migration at the time of partition across the borders of Pakistan and India, and later within Pakistan, through objects and material culture. This mother project envisions creating an archive built with the help of community through people's historical narratives, employing a very participatory approach. The initiation of this living digital archive of visual and tactile memory traces back to around 2012, when I began gathering family objects, repairing them, and documenting them. The objects range from furniture to jewelry to cookware to serveware. During the pandemic, I crossed paths with Curating for Culture India, where I focused on this idea as a culmination of methodologies and visual art practices. This also gave me this space to theorize what idea of repair actually meant for me as a practitioner. These are the images of the furniture pieces that were repaired and restored. Some of these pieces are also reflected in old family photos, which we carefully digitized and captured in their respective conditions. There are a couple of more images of furniture pieces, and to name these furniture pieces, it's actually allocated to the person it really belonged to, and how it sort of kind of transformed into another object that does not really take away the memory that it holds, the memory of ruination that it holds today, but also keeps that memory of ruination with it, but also indicates the rescue and the repair process that it has gone through. The project was further explored during visiting artist fellowship in 2022 at the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute at Harvard University. During the fellowship, narratives, object photography, and archival photography of repair and preservation were curated as installations in the solo show, South Asian Narratives, curated by Sneha Shristi and led by Professor Jina Kim. Some images from the exhibit and pieces can be seen here on display. These were all immersive installations. The installations followed a format that focused on the object through archival and object photography, particularly removing its aesthetic value, and examining the object as a diagram, as a two-dimensional and a three-dimensional object in an archive at the end of its repair and restoration. However, the project also explained its documentation through photographs of the process itself. Here, the archive of documentation and the object restoration itself becomes a two-dimensional diagrammatic element of the archive. Each object in this series is accompanied by a narrative that has helped these objects relive and retell their stories. These narratives and stories are still in progress, developed with the help of the original owners and families of the objects in the collection. The text accompanying the objects leaps through times and memories within the archive. Here, the methodology of microhistories become an important framework for the practice. Through the intensive research and publication of Material Culture and Decolonization post-partition Lahore, I hoped to uncover the process of decoloniality of home through objects varying in categories that I have already explained, but this also included categories like weaponry and fabric. The framework of generational memories was a crucial method for this research. It was published as a book chapter in Region 2021 by Routledge, and this research challenged the conventional ways of curating, repairing, and archiving. Additionally, it invited the viewer to experience the objects through various mediums like text, object photography, and oral histories. A complete process of preservation of the actual objects as an archive of repair was documented and published. I grappled with the purpose of publishing. Seeking answers in existing literature and theories, I was inspired by the idea that genuine art questions existing ideologies as stated by Marcuse. This allowed me to explore beyond my family history, and in addition to my family objects, I included objects of migration from the second author, Ghias Pir, and this dimension really helped me to understand how to engage with the stories, narratives, and objects beyond my own bloodline and view the process with a certain detachment. Decolonizing home through objects envisions questioning the notion of the archive itself by integrating archival methods into visual art practice, as shown in the previous slides. Experiment with these methods as a pedagogical praxis in the classroom became ever so necessary for me as a practitioner and as an academic. A purposeful effort was made to choose objects of the everyday as opposed to those imbued only with the traumatic pasts. This decision aimed to bring out the significance of the mundane and reveal the residual impact of colonization without nostalgia or malicious criticism. Here, the object opens a larger collective, subverting the archive's praxis as a closed institutional or just an elite method. This is a process image of a student's work, which they attempted to retrace the history of a set of cutlery brought from England and now housed in their family home in Kasur, Pakistan. The class produced 7 projects, 7 oral histories, 7 documentative journals, and 7 papers. We experimented in the course with ontological drawings, family photographs, archival drawings, and photography, oral histories and videos, and all of this culminated into a powerful collective exhibition. I will now elaborate on the third leg, which is towards decolonial home constructing the archive. This research is in progress, and I request your consideration for its vulnerability. This unfolded during the Summer Tehqiq project at Habib University, Karachi, Pakistan, in 2023. It aimed to highlight decolonization as a contradictory affliction, often associated with violence in partition narratives, but explored here through the mundane again. While much existing scholarship focuses on the mass violence of partition, this part of the project emphasizes everyday sense-making that kind of knit life together in the laborious act of constructing the archive. Some may raise concerns that creating an accessible archive of historical artifacts is regressive, hindering progress towards a decolonized future. However, disregarding our past is not a viable option in today's world. By preserving and making these artifacts available, we can learn from them and moving towards a more equitable future and history through open access networks. And these are the couple of methods through which the rigorous act of creating the archive and then publishing a photo book at the end was done. The research argues that housing Indian artifacts in the British Museum or private collectors' home did not make these establishments or people any less British. Instead, it highlighted the greatness of the Raj. The main idea is that nostalgia is to be used strategically for decolonization purposes. This archive aims to reverse the traditional archive's gaze, shifting from Eastern objects in Western spaces to Western objects in Eastern spaces. As a form of collective memory, generational memories associated with objects reflect changing cultural scripts that shape our relationship with those objects. Objects that once symbolized bringing a piece of Britain to India for previous generations now hold new meanings. They have now served, they would have served under the British Raj, but these objects remind us of the exchange that took place during colonization, both positive and negative, and are analyzed through a reparative lens, especially after doing the process of repair. One gap in understanding lies in how history is made. And this project offers an alternative approach to mapping people's histories, micro-histories, histories of domesticity, migration, space-making, and architecture post-partition, including voices of the marginalized. Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth addresses theoretical omissions and weaknesses that this research aims to overcome. In his chapter on violence, Fanon asserts that decolonization is inherently violent, involving the replacement of one species of human with another. Using a Marxist dialectical materialism, Fanon highlights the exploitative relationship between colonialist settlers and the indigenous population, where the settlers' material prosperity really relies on the colonized materials deprivation, maintained through organized violence by the colonial state. Fanon emphasizes that decolonization is not solely a nation state, but a social process that meets the colonized proletarians' natives' minimum demands, at least. And thus, Fanon's work serves a foundational assumption for this project. Drawing on Yashin's work on the interdependence of human subjectivity and the agency of material objects, the project analyzes how objects provide a pathway of creating these narratives and interpreting these decolonization effects. And it explores how meanings of family heirlooms with colonial lives and their colonial ties evolve through space and time, and how memories associated with these objects become symbols. Ian Hodder stated that the past is present in a sense that our reconstructions of meanings of data from past are based on analogies with the world around us. Generational memories have evolved with the world, and the collection of personal archives indicates that the same objects have not perpetuated these colonial nostalgias. Instead, they've been interpreted through materiality and design interventions by the local artists and craftspeople. When repairing these objects, information is gathered, appropriate materials are sought, and memories are evoked, and they are reconstructed. There has been much erasure of South Asia's craft history, and tracing these narratives and serving these practices is very important. The objects are selected to contribute to documenting and restoring colonial era artifacts in people's homes, using archiving as an act of affirmative sabotage. The project treats objects as a major source for producing knowledge that challenge the hegemonic Eurocentric knowledge system. This approach mirrors Gayatri Spivak's methodology of examining Hindu scriptures to explore the alternative values of Judeo-Christian beliefs. The Decolonizing Home Through Objects project uses a similar methodology and is very much inspired by it. Understanding the process of decolonization means moving beyond basic definitions of transfer of power. And my project examines decolonization as a systemic force responding to these various structures such as Cold War and the ongoing coloniality that still exists in this world. The process has never fully dismantled in the colonial or the capitalist state structures, and their remnants still exist today. The project also seeks to understand the object itself by constructing a comprehensive biography of each object, asking who owned it, where did it come from, what material did it consist of, how many lives did it have. You can kind of see some images of a restored piece, which was once a kind of turned into a laundry basket, but then sort of it also had a life of a barbecue station. I'll further move on to that Arjun Apodharai theorized that by examining an object's biography, we can understand how its changing context influence society and vice versa. Could you just please hold on a second? There is somebody knocking. Just hold on a second, please.
Sure, Mehwish, go ahead. Yeah, they're here.
While Mehwish is taking a break, we just wanted to remind everybody, a lot of people have joined, that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat either now or you can wait till the end. We will have some time at the end for audience questions.
Yes, sorry. Let me get back to it. The project relies heavily on the biographical method, photography and oral history, focusing on the role of photography and objects in preserving individual and collective memory. The theoretical framing of generational memories and decoloniality shapes this project, emphasizing traditional and local knowledge. The project challenges colonial era academic methods, exploring indigenous archiving practices as a pedagogical and material preservation strategy for intergenerational histories, and somehow family photographs become a huge source of such micro-histories for this project. Home is not just a structure or a physical construct, but a social space with human relationships where subjectivity is formed. Individuals have little control over external forces. The home is often shaped by economic realities and circumstances outside our control, which directly limit our power. This context is critical to understanding why post-colonial artists, writers, and architects resist Western structures of knowledge and academic dominance. To study objects in contemporary society, we must understand their shifting historical context, particularly in post-colonial South Asia. For instance, Lahore's transformation had a significant impact on the urban landscape due to the demographic shifts and religious changes after the partition. And as a logic culmination of my research, transformation into a PhD study, the project explores the post-colonial architectural history of Lahore's colonial settlement called Model Town. Completed in 1924 in line with the planning ideas of British urban planner and founder of the Garden City movement, Ebenezer Howard, Lahore's model town introduced modern domestic architecture and cooperative housing schemes to South Asia. This initiative was spearheaded by an influential Indian barrister, Dewan Khemchand, in close collaboration with the British Raj. Originally intended for upper middle class Indians, upon completion, the elite of the society occupied this cooperative. A few British colonial officers, Indian government servants, businessmen, and retired military personnel, overwhelmingly Hindus and Sikhs. After the partition, 85% of this population had left, making the settlement an evacuee property. Partition resulted in intra and inter-border mass migration of Muslims of diverse backgrounds into the city of Lahore. And there are two stages of model town demonstrating the negation of colonial spatial constructs. One is at the time of its conception by having a separate worship places for Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and gender-exclusive clubs, according to the Indian native culture, and the other is post-partition. Home as Archive project investigates, maps, and documents how these inhabitants, largely Pakistani Muslims, transformed Lahore's model town between 1947 to 1971. And this research scrutinizes how these residents invented a new modern Muslim home that really sits in the post-colonial modern Muslim state of Pakistan. Additionally, the project analyzes the framework of the Cooperative Society Act, which forms the backbone for the decision-making in this housing scheme in the colonial tenure for upper middle class Indians and later Pakistani Muslims. As a crucial need for the project, the research studies how colonial policies and structures faded and the impact they had on kind of domesticity ensuing the birth of modern Muslim home. And the project, through a comparative analysis, seeks to understand the shift in this colonial project from then thought upper middle class housing to post-colonial housing. This research employs intergenerational memory and a historical materialism framework through oral histories, study of private and public archives, and in the contemporary geopolitics and forced displacements due to climate crisis, dispossession, and due to militarism, forced migrations and racial discrimination within Pakistan and South Asia at large. Understanding, documenting, and dismantling these colonial processes deeply embedded within the post-colonial structures and built environment have become ever so urgent to create the reparative future, and also to understand this idea of archive and home as archive itself. So thank you so much for your attention. And this project is deeply very personal and collective for me. Seeking to create this inclusive decolonial archive is a utopian project, I understand, but I hope to fulfill and work on this in years to come. Your feedback, comments, suggestions are most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehwish. That is fascinating. Our next speaker is going to be Johann.
Are you able to see my screen? Not yet.
No, not yet. To all those who have joined in later, we are skipping reading out the bios, but they are in the chat to have a look at it.
Is it visible now?
Yes, it is.
In full screen?
No, they are in the PowerPoint mode, so you'll have to choose the...
Sure. Is it fine now?
No, we're still seeing the PowerPoint.
Okay. Maybe I will first talk and then
Sure.
go through the slides afterwards, if that's fine with you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Or we can do it in this mode also. I mean, it's fine. We can see the slides smaller now.
Okay. Maybe I'll just run through the slides so soon after I speak. Sorry about my technological limitations. So first, let me thank Ishita and also the team of PATIO for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I would also like to mention how serendipitous it is to have Rohan in the as a respondent, because his film Lovely Villa was one of the most important documentaries I saw during COVID, and subconsciously also perhaps influenced our methodologies in conducting research for this film. So today's talk, if I can call it that, would be loosely structured around the questions that we began our journey with. And then I will touch upon two ideas, that of contingency and meditations on impermanence, which perhaps can be brought into the discussion later. So I hope some of you all were able to watch the documentary in the link before this, but for those who didn't have the chance to see the film, the research entailed digging up the history of Watapullo housing scheme, which is located in the central hills of Kandy in Sri Lanka, the whys, the hows, the whos, questions such as in what specific post-independence development and political stage did social housing as a concept gain traction? How did the original inhabitants of Watapullo housing scheme, those who grew up there, and the current inhabitants live in their houses, alter them and demolish them? And piecing together collective and personal memories of the changing social fabric of a closely knit community. B, how did the Watapullo housing scheme relate to other housing schemes or urban housing complexes and flats that were built before this time or afterwards? This meant also briefly delving into the history of urban planning and social housing of the island in general, and also zooming out into the experiments that were going on globally, particularly in India, as the housing minister of that time in Sri Lanka also visited the International Exhibition on Low-Cost Housing in 1954 in Delhi. And C, it was also a broad endeavor to uncover more archival material on architect Minette De Silva. We noticed there was a flutter of interest in Minette in the last 5 years, but the material in the public domain was mostly recycled, or we thought repackaged tellings of material based on her autobiographical book, which she had compiled. So then how did we access new material, gain new insights into her life, her writings, and in the absence of an known archive, how do we create sources in the process? This understanding was also influential and built upon Rachel Lee's work on engaging the archival habitat. And finally, linking the above, how did the very cosmopolitan world of Minette, which she inhabited, relate to the macro and to the personal? For example, how was the experience working with Otto Königsberger and his not so successful prefabricated houses project, as well as the contemporary research of the 1950s on the interwar social housing in the UK that was deemed unsuitable to the user. How did these influence her general approach towards planning and prioritizing the home user? And then the modernist Corbusian example of social housing in Pessac in Bordeaux was also a wonderful case study that we also studied in the process. So when Sumedha, one of the three filmmakers, asked me to be a researcher on the team, I was a bit hesitant, not being any sort of expert on architecture per se. However, over the preceding months, we had shared and discussed books like Jeremy Till's Architecture Depends and Alan de Botton's Architecture of Happiness. And he clearly wanted me to bring my insights from the sociological lens. At first glance, research on a housing scheme sounds very dry and uninspiring, and it implies a linear history of urban development. But in fact, as I will elaborate as I go on, it ended up being a far more expansive and rewarding journey. As someone interested in history, particularly in and of Sri Lanka, this seemed a doubly exciting opportunity to explore uncharted waters. It might be obvious to most of the audience here, but we all bring in parts of ourselves into the research, our training, our exposure, the readings we engage with, and in turn, the research also changes us. Having a very supportive team, those who made the film, also made it a very rich experience for me. It goes without saying that the team influences the scope and depth of the research. And actually, the different facets of their personalities also help bring out the interdisciplinarity in the discussions we had prior to the conceptualizing of the film. So Irushi Tendakon is primarily known as an animator and illustrator, with also background in language and linguistics. Sumudu Atakorala is known equally as a writer of short stories, poems, scripts, as well as an architect and an illustrator and filmmaker. And Sumedha, who's an architect, introduced me to the works of Jeremy Till, etc., and gave his interest in the cycle of creation and destruction. Also influenced how I see the demolition process as equally important to observe, understand, witness, and document the demolition of buildings that we were seeing while we were doing this research. When I gave a talk on a similar topic a few months ago, I asked the question, why do we want to hear the researcher speak about the experience? Because sometimes it can become an act of losing the forest to the trees. So in order to explain that, I said, okay, first we illustrate how varied and extensive the research areas could be. Secondly, to inspire other researchers on the possibilities of method and research. Third, to encourage reflexivity and reflectivity in the practices of research. And finally, which is more obvious, is to share insights into the available resources. So on the first point, today we will speak, I think, a lot about interdisciplinarity. And to be honest, we had to be very conscious of the various angles in which research on social housing schemes had been done before. Most importantly, how these different approaches speak to each other rather than offering them as individually packaged boxes. This was a challenge, but it was also a challenge we all wanted to take on because the end product was to be a quote unquote creative documentary on Minette De Silva's housing scheme. The second point is probably more apparent to architects here, but because the research area was focused on architecture and space, it naturally opened up more unconventional ways of knowing and understanding, which was very inspiring to me to see as an outsider who would usually prioritize the textual sources, the historic photograph of the original site, the ground plan, or the interview transcript. So while photographs of the site and spaces were also featured, Sumudu and Sumedha, the architects, also informed the knowledge with their sketches. So hand-drawn sketches also informed the affective elements of the building. Then 3D renderings of unbuilt spaces, such as community markets, which Minette had designed, and also children's drawings of their houses and the housing scheme. So I noticed in Lovely Villa also there were pictures of children drawing their neighborhood. Similarly, in the book on Pessac, which the sociologist Philip Bourdon writes, at the end is also children sketching that. So understanding the social house from different perspectives, I think, was something that came out of that. And that also informed, as I said earlier, the sociological approach, which I found most useful and highly recommend, which is called Lived in Architecture, Le Corbusier's Pessac Revisited, written in the 1970s, where he interviews the residents and also does a similar approach of documenting the modifications and discussing the sociological underpinnings of the design and the use of the buildings built in 1929. And this prompted an article in the New York Times in the 80s titled, "It's Flexible Enough to Endure." Coming to reflective practice, the team of researchers were aware that we would be contributing something new or contributing new knowledge specifically about the housing scheme, but also touching about histories such as building histories, histories of government-sponsored buildings, etc., that would otherwise only interest a niche group of academics. But the medium, a documentary film featured at a public exhibition in Colombo, meant it was more accessible to a wider group of people. It was also screened at the housing scheme in June this year to a very appreciative audience, many who said they weren't aware of how the history of their scheme was part of a larger narrative of its time. But also, I think as individuals, many of us came together from various backgrounds and had now moved on to other projects. But the afterlife of the research constantly crops up. Thanks to the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art programming, it was interesting to see various groups come together to discuss the merits of the participatory approach used in the initial stages as early as the mid 1950s, as well as concern for the natural elevation of the land and trees, which also harkens back to 1902, whereas Mehwish said Ebenezer Howard's notions of the garden city, which I think now is more famously attributed to Patrick Geddes, was also noticeable at Pesach. So when documenting various sources, we also recorded the soundscapes, like for example, the radio playing loud in the neighborhood to hear, and also to hear the bread vans and the birds. I think I have 3 minutes more. So sources. Given the multidisciplinary approach and consulting multiple unconventional sources. So for example, we looked at topographical maps, survey department measurements, drone footage, also meant the analysis in the experience of watching the film needed to make sense. The more standard sources also were included, such as going to the Le Corbusier archives or the B.V. Doshi or Plesna archives, but we found less specific information about the Vatupullu housing scheme itself. And I would now, in the limited time, go to another source that I found interesting. So I would like to read two excerpts from two poems by Jean Arsanayagam, a celebrated Sri Lankan poet of Eurasian heritage and was married to a Tamil. She lived in the housing scheme, and I located poems that were written during her time at Vatupullu and soon after, when she had to flee to safety during the anti-Tamil riots of 1983. Poetry, I believe, is an unlikely source to be consulted when researching a housing scheme. Yet to me, it offered a personal insight into both the emotional dimensions of a community that is sometimes not captured in oral histories and other sources, and representations of the materiality of the built and natural environment. Those of you who saw the film will also remember a poem in Sinhala written by one of the three filmmakers, Sumudu Athakorala. It is a beautiful composition building on the memories of the interviewees, perceptions, and the physical elements of the scheme. I chose two poems that also connected to Mehwish's talk on materiality and furniture as well, and also thoughts expressed in Lovely Villa, where the narrator talks about refugees that found relative safety in the secular nature of the state-built housing colony designed by Charles Collier, as well as it being a safe haven during the Hindu-Muslim riots of 1992 and 1993. So I will read two excerpts, if you allow me. So the first relates to the 1983 riots. It's called "At the Gate Stands a Mob," July 1983. So if you can also reflect on the materiality and some of the elements of the house. So there's a gate, there's the gardens, the roofs, etc. At the gate stands a mob, wielding swords like samurai, waiting to give battle to a single man defenseless. Great stones and bricks, rods and poles, they carry in their hands to wound and bash his head, axes to hack his limbs, and bombs to burn his house. With folded arms, men and women of the village stood, their faces blank, impassive, waiting for the blood sport to begin. The house next door goes up in flames. Through the garden, the throngs surge in to watch the pyrotechnics on display. Violence thrills. It's not their house, but that of aliens. Mothers lift babies high over the flowering shoe flower hedge. Others rush in, leading children by the hand. The old men watch, silenced by their only comment. The young stand in the mob. What should you say? One man laughingly asked. Shall we throw a bucket of water? Put out the flames. There is no answer. They turn away. The roof crackles sharply and caves in. The people have all fled. The wind blows smoke in my direction too. I'm in the thick of the mobs. It is time for me to flee. The second excerpt is called The Chair, and it refers to a very specific burgomaster chair that's inherited from the Dutch heritage in Sri Lanka. The chair is a symbol of the past, my own lost childhood of bittersweet memories in the housing scheme. A house with three pillars overlooking a verdant green valley filled with paddy fields, trees, and a mud-brown river on which driftwood floated. At a distance grew trees of diverse types. The planter's bungalow, now unoccupied except for a banner preaching monk, echoed the sighs of silence of an earlier epoch of the colonizer, of cocoa and rubber plantations when wild jackals inhabited the jungle. Their cries mournful and haunting, while the sound of incantations could be heard from the hedges of folklore and gossip. I am reminded of my own childhood when I walk alone on country roads, often running errands to the co-op in search of sugar and rice. Or after school with my sister, we would carry our heavy bags uphill for a lunch cooked by Frida, our daily help from the village. Later, we would rush to join the others to play cricket in a garden or round or sull, while the river flowed gently in the distance among the paddy fields, and the world of dreams would return at nightfall. Today, I see the antique burgomaster chair, which reminds me of courage, of valiant survival, a symbol of security in spite of life's ephemerality. So I'd like to hear your comments, both on the process and also on the different sources that we've consulted, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Johan, do you want to just take us through the slides in a minute?
Yes, let me try that. Can you see it now in full screen?
Just click on slideshow. I think it will come up then.
Okay. Now?
No, it hasn't happened. But we can see it in this mode as well. If you just, we're not on slide 1 at the moment.
I'm not on slide. Okay. 1 second. You can't see it moving, right?
No.
Let me open it on it's different. I will share the entire screen and see.
Sure.
Does this work now?
Yes, that works.
So the
Very
first
well.
is the okay, sorry about that. So this is the first book that I really like, which is called Lived in Architecture. And on the right, you see the original housing as Le Corbusier's design, and second, how it has been altered in the 1960s, which is also similarly what we wanted to understand in terms of how the current users have adapted the plans or the typologies given by Minette in the 1950s. This also is referring to Le Corbusier's directives that he got from the industrialist in Bordeaux. And also this is a newspaper article about the flexible users, how users also have the agency to change their houses. These are some of the questions, the implicit research questions we asked, and also some of the sociological questions we wanted to know in terms of, does it matter who's really the author of these houses? Like, were we, yeah, how detailed were we going into that? This is a video, if you can see, of the demolition of the houses in Vatapura, which if I had time, I would have also gone into a discussion about how we think about the depth of buildings. And that's two sides of the same coin in terms of the life of a building. These are some of the drawings that the kids did when we went there. We organized a session run by Irushi. These are some of the plans that the community members shared with us what they had. This is also showing the different modern constructions, how they are going up. It's like someone would say this is changing the original intent of the architect, but how people also have agency to build according to their modern aspirations. These are some of the archival footage of a Montessori, a nursery that was in the community. Also shows the original, some of the architecture there. This is from the low-cost housing exhibition in 1954. These are some of the models also in India. And of course, the survey was an important aspect that Minette used, which was also gaining traction in those years. Jeremy Till, and I finally want to show, she was also in touch with the same vintage of Balakrishna Doshi, and there was correspondence between the two of them. So Minette actually wanted Doshi to come and work with her on this project in Sri Lanka. So this is letters between the two of them, from Corbusier to Doshi. And we also looked at Facebook to see how people are reminiscing their life in the communities. And yes, those are my sources and further reading.
That's great. Thank you, Johann. We may go a little bit over time, but I hope, folks can stay. So we do have time. We do have about 20-30 minutes. So I hope folks are around. But we wanted to invite Rohan Shivkumar next he's the respondent for today's session, but we also wanted to briefly hear about his own work with curating, filmmaking, and education. So Rohan, take it over.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Ishita. Thank you, Patio, for this invitation. I'm going to kind of quickly share maybe 2 or 3 projects that we were involved in, and I'll try and bring out some of the themes that I thought are common between what Johann presented and what Mehwish presented, because both of those presentations brought many sorts of echoes to some of the concerns that we had while we were working on these projects as well, right? So I'll just kind of quickly share screen, and please let me know whether you can see the screen. Can you?
Yes, it's working.
All right. So for the sake of this presentation, I have chosen 4 different kinds of projects that I was working on. All of them seem to be interested in questions of archives, and each of them are, I guess, also interested in the public life of an archive in terms of what that relationship is between the archive and the world outside. And it'll echo many of the concerns that emerged from Mehwish's presentation concerning the idea of the micro to the macro, and what Johann was also really interested in, looking at questions of disciplines and mediums in terms of how they begin to speak to each other. So I'm going to talk primarily about 3 projects. The 3 projects are the 2 films, because in the interest of time, I thought I'd just kind of not talk about the Cinema City project, which was another project which was interested in archiving the relationship between cinema and the city of Bombay. If you guys are interested, and maybe later on, if you think that it may be relevant, we can bring that in. But just because I want to give more time to Johann and Mehwish, I thought what I'll talk about is primarily these 2 films that were really interested in delving into the archive, right? And thinking about how the questions of identity are shaped both at what to use Mehwish's words, at the micro as well as the macro level, and looking at what those relationships can be, right? So the first film is Nostalgia for the Future. This film was made by this producer. This is the producer that gave us money, Films Division India. And Films Division India is, and used to be, I guess you could call it the propaganda wing of the government. And it has an extraordinary archive of the ways in which the early nation state was trying to create a citizen through the making of these films, right? Because in these films, there were always imaginations of who we were supposed to become. These are some of the names of the films: Towards a Better Society, Saga of Progress, A Joint Endeavor, National Foundation. So all these ways in which the great nation was trying to create a space where we could become the ideal citizens of that sort of great nation. And we were really, in this film, really interested in that imagination as it was propagated both by film, as in these films, and Bollywood films, as well as by architecture, because architecture also was instrumentalized in the making of that ideal citizen. So we were really interested in these two relationships, how architecture and film were both involved in the making of that citizen. Right? These, for example, are some of the films on housing that were made by the Films Division India. All interested in cheaper homes for the largest possible population, a film entirely on that exhibition that Johann showed, which was on low-income housing in Delhi. Yeah. So in our film, what we did is that we looked at 4 different homes built over a period of around 100 years. And in each of the homes, we looked at how the idea of the citizen's body was shaped in each of these, right? Because when we are designing a home, we are also we are imagining a body inhabiting that home. So we were interested in that imagination of that body of that ideal citizen. So from the left to the right, we looked at 4 different homes. We looked at a palace built in Baroda by the Maharaja Sayaji Rao, where he imagines a new kind of Indian identity, one that is made out of parts, like a collage identity out of Indian and Western motifs, right? In the second one, we looked at the Nehruvian home as epitomized by Le Corbusier's one of the houses that he built in Ahmedabad, the Shodhan Villa, where he imagines this body naked in nature, whose caste, class, religious identity, gender identities can somehow be erased because they are just naked under the sun. And then we looked at the Gandhi Ashram, also in Ahmedabad, where you have the Gandhian imagination that imagines the body itself as a vehicle for sin and pleasure, and imagines that one can somehow get rid of the body and become a pure spirit. And the building, of course, tries to kind of create this almost rudimentary framework within which the body can be. And the last is what we thought is the machine body, where every single one of us citizens is being kind of, I guess, brought into the great nation building enterprise by becoming part of the machine of the nation. And that we looked at Delhi and its DDA housing projects, which are completely based on these rational, kinds of sizes, etc. Right? So the entire 1 BHK, 2 BHK, 3 BHK square footage. And these are the 4 examples we looked at. There was another home that was haunting all of these, another kind of body rather that was haunting all of these. And this is what we call the subaltern body, the body that did not belong, the body that refused to belong, perhaps. Okay, the body that was always the project of modernity and never could be there. And this really brings me to an important point that emerged, I think, in my mind when we were talking about Mehwish's presentation, which was the idea of the ghost, the lack, like what is missing. Okay, and the question of that what is missing that is haunting that particular object. And maybe we can talk about that later on. The second film we made was Lovely Villa, which Johann so kindly has mentioned as an inspiration to him. Lovely Villa was a film that was interested in the same questions, but was really looking at it more from a very intimate point of view. I was born in 1971, and this is a film about me growing up in this housing colony, which was designed by a state institution, the Life Insurance Corporation of India, and designed by one of the great modernist architects of India, Charles Correa. And in it, there is a certain idea of Indian citizenship that is being kind of, let's say, structured. And I, growing up in that, have lived that kind of idea, I guess, right? So this is my house. This is my mother sitting in my in the living room. And for this film, we mined my personal archive, mined the personal archive of memories in forms of texts, in terms of music, oral memories, and of course, visual memories. And looked at how all of these memories kind of come together and were kind of deployed to be able to create this particular sense of who I am, and I guess through some sort of metonymic imaginings, what me, my home, my city, and my nation was meant to be, right? In all of these, the central question over here is, I guess, lack, loss. What is it that we were meant to be? What is it that that archive wanted me to be? And what is it that finally ended up happening? Again, here too, there is the sense of haunting, of emptiness, the void that is at the heart of the film. And the film explores this also through the idea of loss. My father died a few years back. Charles Correa died a few years back. And these lacks or these emptinesses also are part of the way that the film is really interested in these. Okay. That's my father. Yeah. So these are two projects that were both interested in the archive, the National Archive and a personal archive in conversation with one another, and what those relationships happen in between them. The next example I'm going to be looking at is rather different. This is a project that we just recently completed, and it was a project that was trying to discover the ways in which communities that live in a large national park in the middle of the city access infrastructure. Right? And there are Adivasi tribes or indigenous communities that continue to live there. And often they are denied access to infrastructure because it's imagined that in a forest, people don't live, only animals do. So therefore, they don't need electricity. Right? So we realized very quickly that that access of these communities to those infrastructures was mediated by a series of objects. State agencies created policies and plans that allowed and disallowed access to infrastructure. Tribal communities needed identity cards, documents, artworks. Non-tribal communities held protests. So these were a contested space. The forest was a contestation. And we got really interested in these contestations. Is that how does the forest emerge as a terrain of contestation between objects, really? Because every object here kind of represents a certain kind of claim and a certain kind of identity. A forest is made and an Adivasi is made by the nature of these objects. So what we said is that what we wanted to do was create the research project itself, the form of the research project itself, as a kind of conversation. Right? We realized that what we wanted to do was create a space of unsettling of all these different kinds of imaginings and the nature in which they looked at the forest or they looked at this terrain. So we wanted to make a space where these could then be in dynamic relationship with one another so that they could inform each other and also, I guess, pollute each other. Maybe new alliances could be formed, maybe new imaginations might emerge, and those perhaps might point to possibilities of kind of, let's say, design or intervention. So rather than get into the details, what we then did is that we collected together all these different modes of representation or objects through which representation happens. And these really ranged from a variety of different kinds of points of view, from policy documents that emerge from state organizations to electricity meters that are then placed that allow somebody to get electricity, to identity cards that allow morning walkers to walk in the forest. And what we did is that in the exhibition, we decided to stage an encounter between all of these different objects. This idea of staging an encounter between objects brought all the various narratives that emerge from these objects in conversation with one another. And in the exhibition, then, we also invited communities who represented many of these objects to come and talk to each other. So it was a very multidisciplinary approach. We had activists and social workers as integral parts of the team. They were not somebody they were not as subjects of research, they were the researchers, right? And because of that, we were able to create a space that blurred the boundaries between what the researcher was, what the object of research was. We were able to create a space that allowed us to kind of get musicians from the community to be in conversation with hip hop artists to create new pieces of music. We had a conversation around drawing where an Varli artist was in conversation with an architect to look at what their traditions are concerning representation so that they could learn from each other. The idea was to create a tense space, not a space with a resolved end, but rather a space where these conversations can begin to create new narratives, new, I guess you could call it vectors of affiliation that perhaps might be able to change some of the dynamics that exist in the city. So, which again brings me back, I think, to both Johann as well as Mehwish's presentations, where Johann, I think in his exhibition, is trying to work out with these different mediums, in conversation with one another, children's drawings, policy documents, letters from, Le Corbusier and all of these people in conversation with each other. And Mehwish's carefully curated objects with their stories, personal narratives, and their times together. And both of them are trying to, in many ways, begin to see what are the larger narratives that emerge out of that, out of those conversations, right? I think I'll stop there because otherwise I can go on and on. I don't want to take forever as far as this is concerned. I hope I was not too long, but I'll stop there now. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah.
We definitely have time. Ishita, I don't know if you wanted to, maybe start us off with some moderated questions. And for the audience, I don't see any in the chat yet, but please feel free to just type in your question in the chat or unmute your mic and ask the question yourself if you prefer that.
I think I don't have a question per se, but I'm just wondering if either Mehwish and Johann wanted to respond to what Rohan showed and how to his work there is a conversation across projects. But I just want to remark on this whole amazing journey through scales that we had in just 45 minutes, where we started from relationship between objects, memories, and places. And across the three, Rohan, how you brought us back to the need for understanding objects and its memories to give back to places. I mean, I'm just seeing a pattern here, but yeah, I think if three of you had responses, first of all, to what just was presented, and then we can maybe ask more pointed questions.
Yeah. One thing that struck me about when Mehwish was talking really was this interest in the object as a repository for desire. And then really kind of how does one deal with desire in the way that one captures it? Because desire is this sort of slippery thing. It's a movement, and it also has loss, longing, and when Mehwish is talking about repair, or she's talking about a certain way in which you are trying to bring this object back into the world. I'm actually wondering at what point does the kind of, I guess, the void or the missing, which is an essential part of the object, how does one deal with the idea of the missing, especially in objects that are objects that have emerged out of the partition? People have carried them across borders. People have also left things behind. What happens to everything that is left behind? How do you deal with that question within the idea of the archive?
For most of the objects, and thank you for bringing that up, that's been really a concern, each time when I was preparing any object. And for objects like these chairs or these consoles that had come from Delhi over a train, over a span of time, to exactly replicate them in their, in their perfect condition was never the thought, because you can't really achieve that thing, and that loss neither has to be documented, but that loss has to be contained, because we really can't get over that loss. The minute you said that your film kind of also talks about the loss, I can kind of connect the loss in those objects with that film, and that kind of loss in that film that you speak of, that Charles Korea had passed away, your father had passed away, and that kind of connection that you kind of probably had with that home. I feel that those losses you can't really fill the gap. So it has to be how do you kind of deal with this, is that you let that loss be, you kind of sort of document it. For even like, if I had to repair one portion of an object, I would I have chosen different materials for it to indicate the difference in the materials, that there are two different materials now juxtaposed to each other. So there is no I'm not trying for it to be perfect anymore, because it has to be indicated, that loss has to be indicated. Recently, my mother passed away, and to be honest, I kind of felt that this project will completely change now, because all the objects that I have from her have a very different meaning. And I've found myself going through her diaries and going through, this big treasure trove that she had written to my father and my father had written to her. So, all those things and her poetry diaries. So I felt that what I have been theorizing and what I've been thinking about will probably shift, because I'm feeling that kind of loss, and maybe how I see at loss and what you've left behind will completely alter also. And I think that that is the temporal space in which that project lives. I hope I was able to make some sense.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mehwish.
Okay, so we can take in Priyanka's question at this point, perhaps also connects to what you guys were already discussing. What is the acceptable extent to preserve heritage or vernacular versus viewing it as a representation of a specific era and embracing the evolution and integration that occurs with time, technology, and cultural shifts? Either of you want to take it on first, then we can pitch in.
I'm actually waiting for maybe Johann to respond, since, Mehwish took the first question. Johann.
Yeah, maybe I can just briefly, while I think of the question also, because 1950s is, within the community, they didn't think of their housing scheme as something special until the researchers came and said, okay, did you know that this house was possibly built by this famous architect? And then also how you see your own house changes, right? So in that process of outsiders coming and asking you questions, your appreciation of the archive, as Mavish thoughts, the home as archive also changes. So I think it's interesting how that was documented, or to what extent you want to preserve that. And then do you always have this nostalgia towards, oh, this was the original design, this was how the original paint colors. So do you stick to that, or do you also allow for change to happen? I think that's something that maybe the researcher can't get as involved, because that is not their role. And that's something also, as me as a researcher, I was not involved in the final film, but also in having these thoughts and having these processes and opinions and listening to people. How do you make sense of them? Because they all exist, and like you said, they talk to each other, and sometimes they make sense in the process and in the afterlife, if that makes sense.
Mehwish, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just slide a bit, because I feel that as an architect, one has to really control themselves, that whenever you build a project, you have to immediately divorce it also. And because you can't just go around saying people that you can't really change anything in whatever I've designed. And that's the kind of an attitude that we have to take with the built environment, because atmosphere is going to be there, time is going to be there, new people will come around and all that. So I feel that anything which is happening to a built environment is kind of acceptable until and unless it starts deteriorating, and we're not upkeeping that. I feel that this is until and unless we go into all the bureaucracies of bylaws and all that, I feel that buildings will age with time, and their meanings and their purposes and their functions will change and alter.
I keep thinking about the word vernacular, and vernacular is something, that, I mean, in my head, it's usually something that's off the people, a language that doesn't come from the top, but language that is, I guess, from the ground. And the vernacular in that sense is always very mutable. It's always changing. It's always learning new things, constantly shifting, right? And I think that is its fundamental, I guess you could call it, characteristics. It doesn't lie in the building as much as it lies in the dynamics that allow it to constantly mutate and shift based on what communities and people want in their lives. And I think if one is able to think about the preservation, as it were, of those dynamics and its relationship with the building, I think then that might be a way of us, maybe addressing that question that Priyanka is asking.
We have a
Peter,
raised.
and then
Oh, sorry.
sorry. Yes, go ahead, Priya.
I was just going to say that we have somebody raised a hand if you want to unmute yourself and ask that question. And I think then Peter had also raised his hand, so we can go in that order. And then Sarah.
Okay. Look, I want to. I had a look at the film, the film about is this an architectural documentary? And it raised some questions for me about conventions of narrative, because people who write history in the conventional sense actually have a ritualized process of communicating. But when it comes to using other media like films and drawings and interviews that are live in film, I think there are very many different components to that. And I think there is a great deal of orchestration that needs to take place. I mean, I have a personal reaction to the film that we were all meant to watch. And that is, I raised questions about the amount of effort that was put into the drawings that produced that narrative, or that the vehicles for the narrative, compared to the wonderful interviews. I mean, there were some amazing characters actually talking about things, and to me the question is, how do you balance all these things in terms of producing a very coherent and powerful narrative? I mean, is it something that is to do with having a bit of this and a bit of that, or is it to do with editing some bits out? Because those forms of communication are in great competition with a lot of other people using those media. And I mean, one of the issues is time. How much information or how much of your narrative do you put into a particular piece of time space? Anyway, look, those are just some rambling thoughts that I had about the issue. I mean, I admire the work that was done, but I do have some questions about how one goes forward with that, with expanding the palette of communication that people might be using. Thank you.
Maybe I can respond very briefly to that. Also, all the comments, criticism, and praise goes to the filmmakers, which I was not part of that process, but I understood that there's hours of footage. And when you're telling a story both about a housing scheme and an architect, and you're trying to highlight them and the community, you're doing it. It's not just the building; it's all about the people who live there, their memories, and then to condense it to a watchable length of film. It's a really arduous process, and I think and each person will have different approaches towards that. So I think that's a more of a creative and editing process. The raw footage would obviously be part of an archive that could be used by researchers. But when you're communicating something about this, the history, because it was relatively unknown till it was commissioned by the MMCA. So I guess the fact that people are talking about it and seeing, okay, these ideas about participatory architecture, environmental sensitivity are not as new as we think. They're not in the last 10, 20 years. These were probably 100 years ago that these conversations were taking place about participation and users, obviously to varying degrees as well. So yeah, it's also the prerogative of the filmmaker to choose. So yeah, that's the only answer I can give.
Peter? Yes.
Well,
Thanks all three speakers for some really rich material. I've met the first two speakers for the first time. It's a great pleasure. I'm reconnecting with Rohan, who I met a few years ago at a conference where you first showed the film, and I was really enchanted by the lovely villa at the time. So it was nice to hear you explain it again. And my question comes back to what Mehwish said was the name of the title of the actual thesis you're working on at McGill, my alma mater. It's rather nice to know you're working on this sort of material there, which was certainly not something that was being done at the time I was a student there many years ago, which was Home as Archive, the title Home as Archive, which we're all talking about in each of these presentations. But I, particularly in your presentation, where you talked repeatedly about the making, the painful, meticulous, intensive work of making the archive. In each example you showed, of which you seem to be extracting, and as has been already commented on, and repairing, and if we're sort of transforming to some degree the object as you make it archivable, I suppose, and as it gets exhibited in a different context, taken out of the home, as I seem to be observing what your method or the inquiry was doing. And so that question of what is missing that Rohan has mentioned a few times is maybe the central driver for the poetics of the filmmaking that he's been involved in, I think there's that sense of your inquiry is in making the archive is removing it from the house. But the title you use reminds me of perhaps the opposite, and a paper that I worked on with Manu Shopti, another wonderful scholar who I don't think is here tonight, but has been attending some of the other conversations previously, who's now in Queensland. But the two of us who have intimate knowledge of a number of interiors, including, for instance, the apartments, the homes of Charles Correa over many years, have observed in those rather elite and special homes of actual architects the fixity and the presence of certain objects in those homes, which become as important over time as you visit repeatedly over time in a sort of a long collegial or social relationship with these persons. The home, which obviously they've designed and is sort of a theater of representation of who they are in their design world, but how these objects, which are not the product of their own design, but more of their curation, precisely what I think this session is also about, becomes an important part of that interior, important part of the design. Both Manu and I were working outside of our expertise. We're not interior designers, we're architectural scholars, architecturally trained, but we were fascinated at this extra dimension of the work of these notable architects. We talked about Doshi's house in the same piece, and a few other notable contemporaries of theirs in India, and how observing these interiors over time, as I say, those objects are always there, and over time new ones arrive and are added to the curated interiors. And it's what I guess the question I'm putting to you is whether Mehwish, in the interiors, your own intimate home, your own home, and the homes you've observed in Model Town in your project, have you been able to find a way in your methods to look diachronically over time to see how those interiors have perhaps held some of those objects that you are archiving in certain places of privileged places where they belong, or do they move around and become, as you said, rather interesting, their purposes change as they become damaged and their function becomes useful or not for other purposes. But just the choreography of those objects within those interiors, somehow I think that's part of the 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 question that we architectural scholars, predominantly in the space of this discussion, might be thinking about: how are we learning more about architecture, or through architecture, about home, and beyond the design of the architect's intention? That was another interesting point made earlier about, who does it matter whether it was designed by Le Corbusier or by KRVIA or Doshi or De Silva? To what extent is that important? Or how is the home lived in? Of course, the Boudon book from the 70s about Passac is all about that question. 50 years on, who cares whether it was this precocious young architect in the 20s who built these houses? How have people actually made a home from them? And so is this archival process, I mean, just to be a bit blunt, but in a hopefully provocative and thought-provoking way, by curating the objects of the home and taking them to Harvard or whatever and showing them somewhere else, can we have the home at the same time? I'll stop commenting and leave it with that question to see whether there's any more thought.
Could you repeat your question?
Well, the question is, if you remove the object, if you take the object and archive it,
right, sure,
you place it and put it somewhere else. Can we? Is it a study of the object, or how to come back to your title, Home as Archive? How is the home archived through
understood.
the object?
Right.
Central, I mean, maybe a really big question for your project in particular, I suppose.
Right. So for me, this was more like a process of documenting histories through these objects. And just to give you an example, and I'll just be very brief about it. So there have been objects which had a life in a veranda, because houses were elaborate, they were bigger, they were more like villas, and these are like literally right post partition big projects, and post partition 8-canal villas, etc. But how a family and how let's say how these families their lives were transformed because the socioeconomic conditions of the country were transformed, because politics was kind of transformed. So taking this cue from one particular object, like a recliner chair, this chair was brought in 1948 from Delhi, and this belongs to Khan Bahadur, who was basically a chairman of India Railways, and then he shifted to Pakistan, Lahore, and with his wife. And later on, he moved into this place called Mamdot Villa, which is right on the Mall Road in Lahore. And he had this big, huge, elaborate villa, etc. But then later on, due to nationalization in the Bhutto's regime, this family lost a lot of wealth. This family lost a lot of industries, etc., etc. And then these homes were transformed. These were transformed into 1-canal villas, and then became smaller and smaller and were distributed among families. And that recliner, which was once placed in a large veranda in a Delhi big Haveli, and then in a large veranda of an 8-canal house, completely transformed into a laundry basket that I showed you in one of the images, and once also became like a barbecue station, kind of stand for the barbecue, and how it has lived all those lives. And then it went through the process of restoration and documenting these histories. And the history of just this particular object was documented through speaking to 5 different people of the same family, and how this one particular chair moved from different homes and had all these lives, and what they view, of this particular chair, what memories they had with this particular chair, and then what kind of story it actually told beyond itself. What, the socioeconomic conditions of the country, the political regime, how it affected their family, how it affected the space within it, how the space actually transformed by, keeping that particular chair there. as one piece, as a barbecue stand, or as a laundry basket, or as living as a recliner. So these are this is the meticulous process, and because of the time shortage, I was really unable to delve into each and every piece. So each and every piece kind of documents these histories in this particular purview. And my project at McGill will also sort of look into this phenomena of home as the archive, the actual the phenomena where we're not looking like we're actually detaching archive as an institutional phenomena and as an elite phenomena. But when we look at homes as an archive of personal histories and personal memories, it kind of subverts the gaze itself. It also kind of brings in the narrative from the other side. So that's the kind of aim. And we can turn back to it after 5 years when I'm done.
If I may, I could also add to some of the questions that Pete was asking. Also, it's a discourse that's happening, I think, in museology as well, how some of these objects are devoid of their context, either during colonial times when they are taken out from temples and then brought and then given this kind of special place in the museum. And also the question actually made me think about a paper by Ed Hollis talking about unreliable guides, right? And introducing mapping and performing these interiors. I think he also has a book about the Memory Palace, where it's a book of lost interiors and how we think that objects cannot speak for themselves, but they need to be spoken for. So I think, I mean, these are conversations that are happening in terms of can the home be an archive in itself, in a sense that, oh, you don't touch it, you keep everything where it is, or is it a living archive? Like the home is also a living space where people sit on shelves, people use vases, people use all of these things. So then how do you find this mid ground where there's usability and then there's this distance between, as soon as you put something in a glass box, then that distance, the gaze, you said the colonial gaze that museums and these institutes have. I think these are some of the conversations that have been, these questions have been raised, and I don't think there's a final answer. But then if you take of house museums where someone says, okay, this house has to be left in its original state because I want this to be a museum, then I think that's another kind of case, I think.
I was thinking of actually the opposite when Peter was talking. I was thinking about actually not the home as the archive, but the archive as a home. In a sense, I was thinking about homes not as fixed things, but homes that are always in the making. They are constantly making them. They are accumulations of things. And when I was making both my films, Nostalgia as well as Lovely Villa, I think the way that I was looking at the archive was looking at the ways in which these images, these ideas have become ways in which I have been able to, I guess, make a home. What are the fragments of the past and of the world I'm living in through which I make meaning of the place that I'm in? And I think that became an important kind of way for me to think about at least my relationship, the relationship between homes and archives. Just as a
And the film really captures the question that you're having, right? You're bringing photographs, you're bringing memories, you're bringing songs. I think the film is a medium that I think you really think works to have these conversations.
Sarah, you had a question, then?
Yeah, I'll keep it very short, but I think all of your work is very inspiring. And I just have more of a reflection, because I'm also a historian who looks at the 19th century. And I'm just wondering, the further we go back in time, does it become more difficult to work like you guys are doing, interdisciplinary and using architectural, various media beyond the written academic paper? And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, like how do we deal with audiences that are no longer there, like remnants of people who are no longer there? And a second question is, I hope I'm audible. Maybe I should turn off my video.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. A second question is very practical for Mehwish, because you mentioned, the decolonial, and you're also working with oral history. So one practical aspect that I have encountered when doing interviews is that some people are very nostalgic about the colonial period. And so how do you deal with that in your research, and have you encountered that as well? Thank you.
Yes, I have encountered that, and I feel that you can't really. I feel that the decolonial aspect or the the decolonial framework really is about the free speech. It is about how you kind of feel and interact with that memory and interact with that material. Uh, so it's never really a directional message. It's more about a story, where was this object from? What do you kind of, what are your first memories with it, etc., etc. And if they are nostalgic about that particular past, because I keep on also bringing this point that the idea is not to just build on the traumatic past and the violence of partition, because there has been a big amount of literature on this, and I'm not in any capacity to be commenting over it. My understanding and my purpose is to actually look at the mundane. What was happening, what were people eating, when they were, or when they moved into those particular homes, what were they thinking, what were women thinking when they moved into these 8 canal villas from really small streetscapes. Were they feeling safe, were they not feeling safe? There are examples of a lot of people, especially from there was this woman in my family who kind of moved from this 8 canal villa and moved into a smaller house and actually lost a lot of wealth in hindsight. But because what it was, this role of gender with moving into these evacuee properties, questions like these. So yes, while there is this nostalgia with the past, we need to, and another thing that I keep on thinking, that we might have to use this nostalgia strategically and kind of place it in a nuanced way, that yes, we can't really keep on saying that yes, we got the railways because of that. We really have to understand the nuances behind the railways and why was it constructed. So we really need to put these thoughts into like a historiographer or like a historian, and find the records for it, and then bringing in the primary sources into it. And just to connect this with your first question, when you're talking about 19th century, and the minute you keep on going back, you might not have the primary sources to have a conversation with, like oral histories or something. But then there are oral traditions, which are go through one family to another, and all that sort, right? And those oral traditions are of great value. Recipes handed from one family to another family in a form of a song or a poem. That's something to be really looked into. Those kind of interactions.
We had an interesting kind of problem actually when we were working on that Forest in the City project. Okay. We had communities, indigenous communities, obviously have had none of our conventional ways in which we record our past. I mean, the objects, there are no written histories. There's art that happens, but the art itself is the vernacular. It has changed. It has transformed substantially. And the art is constantly evolving today and will continue to evolve as time goes on. But we still wanted to kind of bring their voices in conversation with the I guess the more state corpus, the state imaginings, because we wanted to give them a space in which they could speak, right? So often what happened is that the communities themselves were, there's no other way of putting it, but were actually rewriting the past through the today. They were making work that created a claim of legitimacy within the forest. And sometimes claiming that these were traditional. They may or may not have been, okay? But they were using the idea of tradition and the idea of oral history strategically to make a political claim upon the landscape. And we were absolutely fine with that, right? For us, it wasn't really about reclaiming the actual story of really what happened. It wasn't really part of what we were interested in, honestly. We were really interested in the past as instrumentalized by the communities to make a claim upon the forest, to make a claim for authenticity, of indigeneity, of having a right to be there, because that was the only way that they could ever get access to electricity, water, just land. The fact that they can continue to live there was predicated on the fact that they could claim that they are authentically there. And they were using, an idea of oral history, an idea of a past to be able to make that claim. And that is what we felt was great. We didn't have a problem with that.
Hmm.
I just have one last question and we can close. I know we have run over time, but it's just engaging enough. Just if you wanted to briefly touch upon the question of the impact or the reach of your project in terms of public engagement, because I think we have focused so much on the micro. If we can just step out and talk about why are these practices important, or what drives your practice when you think about public and the community engagement. Very short answers, if you could keep.
Chita, whom are you asking this question to?
All three of you.
Okay, let Johann go first. Yeah, I just picked him. Yeah.
Yeah, so as a researcher, I was kind of thrust upon with this role. And then obviously over the last 2-3 years, I've grown into being more sensitive towards the topic and also talking about it from various fields. So for example, we still have contact with the community and they're also interested to know how other people respond to it. I mean, it also gives them a sense of pride that, oh, people in Colombo are talking about it. There's international attention given towards it. But also it gives us an opportunity to know that histories, I mean, I know, Ishita, you've been involved in projects that document building histories and engineering histories and health histories, that these are histories that are worth talking about. It's not like a niche thing that's only spoken about in academia, and how we as individuals do have a role to play in that or to be aware of that. And I think there's a general trend globally to be aware of this. But like Rohan, you said, how history is being instrumentalized in the current context is also something to be critical about, but also see different sources of how these are being presented. And as the topic of this or the theme, it's about media, right? Media and architecture. So I think it's something that maybe I will continue to think about, how we use these mediums to have these conversations. And I think even what we're doing today is also some kind of discourse around this. So I really appreciated preparing for this and having this conversation.
Mehwish, and then we can close with Rohan Shivkumar.
So I think it has been like a very careful point of me doing it in my studio and then moving into this, to moving and bringing this forth to public, disseminating it at various platforms, be it conversations, be it talks, be it presentations, and then taking it out to my for publishing it, and then interacting with someone else's family's heirlooms rather than just speaking about mine because I could take leverage with that, etc. Then moving beyond and taking it into the classroom, and how whether these methods and methodological framework at large really works or not, and then opening it to a curated, opening it to a public, in the form of exhibition. So it's not just exhibitions. Basically, make exhibition making as a methodology, using that to also disseminate and to also generate the discourse, because it becomes like a continuous discursive phenomena in which it keeps on brewing from one person to another, from one object to another, and from one family to another family. So that has been my process so far. And I feel that within the PhD studies, because we have a framework, etc., so this will probably be into, will be very studious and will be very into a very kind of a, framework of academia. But however, I'm going to, my methods and, primary sources will remain the same. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I really think that, especially in India, we desperately need more public conversations around questions surrounding architecture and the public realm. And I think the academic space is one of the few spaces that we have that can generate that sort of conversation. So I really think that, and very often, I think we had this in the earlier conversation as well, the academy is seen as a space where people think, and the world of practice is where people do. But I think that is doing a disservice to both the practice as well as the as well as academics. When I think of Korea, Charles, that is, his ability to be able to create public discourse around questions that he felt were important, whether that's for Marg or whether that's his work for the hawkers or his work for the midlands, was exemplary in the way of a practice that is showing its concern for what the city should be. Or what this and I think academics also and discourse making should be considered an integral practice of architecture, not something that happens, in academic spaces. And I think a lot of architects, especially now in Bombay, at least, I don't know about any other city, seem to be taking on that. You have young kinds of firms that are doing projects that are pro bono sometimes, that are exhibitions on, the friends of mine did something on toilets, for example, public toilets, right? Another group has done something in Bandra. There's a Bandra collective doing something concerning the public realm in Bandra. So I do think that this is an important thing for us to engage with more and to also validate it. Unfortunately, what happens within, our conventional architecture, at least within the Mumbai University validation systems of what is considered valid practice, it is not counted as practice. What is counted as practice is either you have to write a paper in some journal or you have to make a building, right? These are the two things that are allowed. You have these sorts of making a film, who cares, right? Or doing an exhibition, some 15 people saw it, 100 people saw it, doesn't matter. It doesn't count for anything. So most of our research ends up becoming, circulates within only our academic spheres and never kind of finds its way out. So somehow we have to be able to transform that imagining, at least in terms of what an academic practice is about. I think that's it. Thanks.
I think that's a very powerful thought and perhaps something we are striving towards. And so will this series, I think, keep building that conversation further. How do we transform this understanding of research-based practice? On that note, first of all, thanks to the whole room for being here beyond time, and more so to Mehwish, Johann, and Rohan for sharing your work with us, reflecting with us, and engaging in such a thorough conversation. Thank you, everyone, and see you the next month, next PATIO Conversation.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, everyone.